For this episode, we were honored to speak with Shaun Chamberlin. Shaun Chamberlin is an author and activist who's been exploring collapse and possible responses for over 20 years. He is the editor of Surviving the Future, Culture, Carnival, and Capital in the Aftermath of the Market Economy, and his late mentor David Fleming's Lean Logic, a dictionary for the future and how to survive it, as well as executive producer of a 2020 film, the sequel, What Will Follow Our Troubled Civilisation. He puts the theory into practice as one of the custodians of Ireland's legendary free pub, the Happy Pig, and was involved with the Transition Towns movement since its inception, co-founding Transition Town Kingston and authoring the movement's second book, The Transition Timeline, back in 2009. He was also one of the first Extinction Rebellion arrestees in 2018 and now leads Stirling College's online program Surviving the Future, Conversations for Our Time. Well, Shaun, we are so excited that we get the opportunity to talk to you today.
It's great to be back, guys. I really enjoyed it last time.
Yes, on our previous podcast, Breaking Down Collapse, we had the opportunity to have a conversation with you, but it has been a long time. So for those that had tuned in then and were familiar with that conversation and are now just hearing about how you're doing now, maybe just fill us in. How have things been over the last, year, 2 years?
Yeah, good. Let's see. Yeah, I think so. There's this. I'm actually visiting my mum over in Devon in England at the moment, but the community where I live in Ireland, the Happy Pig, we just at that point I think moved it into this kind of co-ownership model, which is a whole long story in itself, and it's really working. It's really great to be in a community where things are nice, everyone's getting on and things are working well. And when things need doing, we talk about them and get them done. So that's kind of a joy and a real kind of sustenance in everything else that I do. And yeah, still running these Surviving the Future courses through Vermont's Stirling College, and coming up in a couple of months to the next live deeper dive, which I'm quite excited about because we've just had confirmation from Ian McGilchrist that he's going to join us as a guest, and he was someone who was talked about a lot on the previous deeper dive, so I'm really excited to meet him for the first time, and Lila June and a couple of other guests I've not met before. So yeah, things are well in the in the wider context of things not being so well.
Well, and it's great to hear that. For those that haven't heard our previous conversations, when you mentioned something like the Happy Pig, they might not have any idea what you're talking about. So fill us in on that.
Sure. So, where to begin that story? I guess the short version is that we have a pub, it being Ireland, called the Happy Pig, and it's run on what we call gift economy principles. So completely moneyless. People can turn up and stay for free. It's we feel a great distaste for the fact that in our world people just have to pay a lot for the right to exist, essentially. Just to have a place to lay your head, you're paying rent, paying mortgage, and then having to go and sell your labor or sell your products or whatever it is in order to pay for that. And so yeah, we wanted to create a space where people could just be and have a chance to step outside of all of that. And I guess I should say that a lot of the money for that came from my best friend Mark, who also lives there. He decided, I guess about 15 years ago now, that just about everyone he knew was doing something they didn't believe in. They were doing it for money. And so he kind of challenged himself and thought, well, what would it be like to live without money? And so he quit money for a year and wrote a book about it called The Moneyless Man. And I met him just at the end of that year, read his book, was blown away by it and his kind of commitment and integrity. And he ended up, he lived for a year without money, wrote a book, and then was like, you know what, I've never been happier. I'm just going to carry on living like this. But ironically, the book did really well. And so he ended up with lots of money from the royalties of the book. And we were like, well, God, what do we do with this? And so what we did with that was, well, the way we talk about it is like how slaves used to, if they sort of did well for themselves, buy their own families out of slavery, like buy their own ownership effectively. And we look at it kind of like we bought that land out of the market economy. So, we don't ever expect to see that money back. It's not an investment or anything, and it's now in co-ownership. So if we were going to sell it, all six of us would have to kind of unanimously agree to do that. So essentially, we've kind of thrown that money away, created a space that's kind of been bought out of the economy, and so anyone else who wants to can come and be in that space and experience. And I think it sounds really radical to kind of modern ears, but actually, it's really just a rekindling of the tradition of hospitality. Like a century or two ago, if someone turned up on your doorstep, you gave them a bed for the night. That was just how it was, and there
You
were
didn't
reasons
charge
why
them rent. It wasn't an Airbnb.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was just hospitality. And so, a lot of people talk about it as a bit of a throwback. But we see it in a lot of ways as a bit of a throw forward. I think the monetary economy is not in good nick, let's say. And so really what it's about for us is building the sequels, like deciding what we want the next chapter of humanity's story to look like, and getting on with making it now, because it feels a good way to live. So that's the Happy Pig. The six of us who co-own and live there, and a steady stream of interesting folk who come by and stay for a while. Yeah.
What does that look like as far as the number of people that come by? How do they find out about you? What do they do while they're there? Do they support you at all? Do they help with the chores, or are they just, what does that look like?
Sure. Well, a lot of questions there. Maybe I'll start at the end. So people are not obliged to help out. If people just want to come and lay around in bed and then go for a walk and read a book. We've got an amazing library there. We've got table tennis and table football and darts and fun stuff you might expect in an Irish pub. And so there's definitely no obligation, but very often people do want to chip in and help out. And so if people ask, we certainly can say, yeah, great, come and, depends on the time of year, but come and help us dig over the raised beds, or make the fire each day, or change the sheets, or whatever it is. And people often ask, how do you make any money? How do you keep things going? And the answer, of course, is we don't make any money. That's kind of the point of it. But really, we're so used, as a society, we're so used to thinking of things in terms of money. You don't actually need money to get things done. You need people doing things to get things done. And one way of motivating them is to pay them. But in fact, there can be many other ways. Most of the human story was told when money didn't exist, in fact. And so, we, the original idea was that we would homebrew the booze, the alcohol, which we did. But actually, one thing that very often happens is that people come and stay and bring a bunch of alcohol with them and donate it to the place. So we've actually got a decent amount of kind of, what would you say, like conventional alcohol and kind of homebrewed stuff. So we're not, paying for supplies in that sense. We're growing the food. The kind of labor of keeping the place tidy is just something that we do in service to a story we want to tell in the world. Numbers of visitors really vary. As you would expect, it dropped off hugely during COVID lockdowns and all of that. Has kind of picked up. There's a number of regular kind of events with the local community that go on. So we have like traditional music nights, have one of our residents, Alwyn, runs kind of yoga classes and foraging walks and things like that from the place. So people locally can come and use it as a kind of free event space for whatever they want to do. And then, people passing by really, as you'd expect, like when the weather's nicer, we get a lot more. Like we have a bunk room in the Pig that's got 4 beds. That's usually, it's rare that that's not enough. Like occasionally you get a group of people turn up that's bigger than that. And there's also on the piece of land there are kind of 3 buildings. So there's the Happy Pig itself, and if people are curious, you could look at my darkoptimism.org. The projects page there has kind of pictures and video and actually a little film that Channel 5 in the UK made about us. So there's the Happy Pig itself, which when we got the land was actually a pigsty. There was a sort of corrugated iron pigsty on the land, and not the kind of thing I'd ever dream of putting a pig in. It's a horrible little thing. And so, we kind of built the Happy Pig on the foundations of that, ran a kind of volunteer ecological building course, and people came and kind of learnt to build with straw bales and to build the place kind of as the course, if you like, as their way of learning the skills. And so, I might mention actually, so one reason it's called the Happy Pig is because obviously it's hopefully a happier place than what was there before. Also because Socrates famously said once, it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, because he thought, humans were so superior and capable of higher pleasures and that kind of thing. And we disagree with that so profoundly that we named it the Happy Pig in dishonor of Socrates. So there's the Happy Pig, and then there's like a kind of traditional Irish farmhouse on the land that was there when we arrived. And 4 of us have kind of rooms in that. And so if there's a kind of overflow, sometimes someone might stay in a room that's unoccupied. And then Mark, he is now living without electricity. So he got to the point where he was like, well, off-grid's all very well, but like nobody's told me how you build a solar panel without building an industrial society, and nobody's told me how you build an industrial society without devastating the ecosystem. So until people work that out, I'm gonna just learn what it is to really live in relation to my local landscape. And so he's actually built himself a cabin that he sort of dragged the wood out of the forests, and beautiful cabin that he lives in, and that's got no running water, no electricity, just goes to the spring each morning, collects his water. And so those are the kind of 3 buildings on the site. And Mark's also a writer, so his most recent book is called The Way Home: Tales from a Life Without Technology. So a lot of people who are kind of interested in older ways of living, I suppose, turn up interested to meet Mark and hear about things that are going on. There's also a guy, Julius, who lives with us, who runs a YouTube channel around kind of wilderness survival skills and things like that. And so we've got quite an interesting little gang. And during the summer, there's usually someone staying, and they might be staying for a shorter while or a longer while. And sometimes there's a flurry and it all gets a bit hectic, and sometimes there's quieter periods and it calms down. And actually, Mark has a lovely little saying. He talks about how if you've got a pool of water and there's no through flow, it starts to get quite stagnant and a bit ugly. But if you've got just a little trickle of through flow, then it stays kind of fresh and sweet. And it feels a bit like that. Our community is kind of kept fresh by the kind of through flow of folk who find their way there. And I think you asked how people find it, and there's a lot of stories about that, because we don't actually put the address online. And so, people find it in all kinds of ways. And we like to think that it gives us a kind of higher class of guest, if you like, if there's a certain adventure involved in finding your way there, and a story or a connection or whatever it is. And that works out pretty well for us. So people come in all sorts of curious ways.
So one of the things that I love as I hear about this, Shaun, when we talk about resilience, there's a wide range of what that could look like. Everybody has different situations. Somebody might just want to continue living their normal life and, just have a little bit of food storage on hand. Others might like build an off-grid community that's totally isolated from all of society. You've got this fun blend where it's this great community, but you allow people to come visit, even for temporary periods of time, but you're educating and doing all these other things. So as you describe it, I imagine there are people listening that are thinking, oh, that sounds amazing. I would love to escape the daily grind. I would love to not have my life focused around money. But maybe talk us through what are some of the things that are hard about it? What are the challenges?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say, you mentioned that word resilience, which I've had a long relationship with over my years. And I think to kind of frame what I'm about to say, like, I think a lot of people imagine that resilience is correctly predicting the future and preparing for it. I think it's all going to hell, so I've got my, tin goods and my bunker and whatever, or, I think it's going to be fine. But actually, I think what resilience is finding a path that makes sense across the widest possible range of possible futures. You don't need to worry about the impossible ones. Like I don't think we're going to be colonizing Mars anytime soon, personally, and I think I could make a pretty strong argument for that. But yeah, like the one thing we know about the future is that we're going to be wrong about it. Predictions about the future have a poor record. So that's the first thing is, I think arguably the first measure of resilience is, are you actually enjoying what you're doing? Is it actually something that you're excited to tell people about, or that you're proud of in yourself, that you believe in, whether that's creating some mad moneyless pub in the west of Ireland, or whether it's just raising a beautiful family, or restoring a piece of land, or whatever it may be, but something that you really feel good about in the now. Because my good friend Michael Dowd, who some of your listeners may be familiar with, died very suddenly a couple of weeks ago, and that could happen to any of us, obviously. So resilience is a relative term for human beings, and yeah, finding joy in what you do is, I think, is a really key part of it, and often underplayed in a bit of a kind of survivalist narrative. And that really ties into some of the things that are difficult, because I think whenever you're trying to do something that's not in alignment with the dominant story of the society you're operating in, it's going to be a lot harder than if it was. Like if I decided I wanted to ride horses everywhere, that would have been really easy a few hundred years ago, because all the infrastructure was there. I could get my horse free-shoed up the road, and I could get a horse pretty cheaply from the local horse dealer and all of that. And none of that's there anymore, right? So, if I want to live like that, then it's going to be a lot harder. And the same applies to some extent to what we're doing. It's really hard to, for example, let people know about the traditional music nights, because in the past, that was all done by word of mouth, and maybe you stuck a poster up in the local shop or whatever. Now everyone expects it to be on social media. And so, you can still stick a sign up, but nobody sees it, because that's just not how people are used to finding out about local events anymore. And so I think that's really one of the challenges, is just that, the wider infrastructure and expectations aren't there. Another one is, the kind of path by which we got to where we are now. Mark and I met, must have been about 2010, when we'd both just written our first books, and sort of met a thing called the Dark Mountain Festival that some of your listeners might be familiar with. And I was really inspired by hearing about Mark living without money. And one thing he'd learned from his year of that, so most of that time he was living in a caravan parked on a farmer's land, who said he could park there in exchange for a bit of help at harvest time, unpaid. And he loved it, but he came to understand that it wasn't in any way sustainable to be doing it alone. At some point, at the very least, he was going to get sick or get injured or whatever, and you rely on other people. Like, I think one of the myths of the I don't know, ecologically aware movement, and to use the broadest term I can think of, is this idea of self-sufficiency, which has the same flaws. I think last time we talked about the kind of myth of financial independence, and how it doesn't really exist, because you're always going to be dependent on someone, whether you get what you need from them through paying them, or whether you get what you need from them through relationships. And the same is true of the idea of self-sufficiency. It's like the green movement's version of that, the idea that I'll just grow my food and have my patch, and then, you know, I don't need anybody else. It's nonsense. The very nature of being alive actually is interdependence. And so Mark had kind of realized that, and I was coming out of a kind of community activism background, and we started plotting together about creating some kind of moneyless community was what we had in mind at the time. And then we partnered with a group called the Ecological Land Cooperative that was just getting set up, which is going great guns still, and I'm very proud to be involved with. But the challenge that came there was it's very hard to dig out of yourself, I think, the stories that you were raised with about what's important and what success looks like, and, you know, what we should be striving for. And I think I really found that, I'm trying to think what the short version of this story is, that essentially we put a few years into trying to set something up on this land in Devon, actually very near here. My mum moved to where she is now because she wanted to be close to where she thought I was going to be living. And actually she loves it around here, and she's still here and I'm not, but that's how it goes sometimes. And yeah, long story short, I ended up in the situation where you know, Mark and I had been working on this for a few years, and the rest of the land co-op, and then Mark had to pull out of what we were trying to do here. And everyone was encouraging me to kind of, oh, you should keep going, you know, you've got the land in place, like, you know, you just need to find some other people that you can partner with. And so I tried to do that, found a few wonderful people, and we all moved onto the land together, and we were living in these caravans. And, you know, with hindsight, it doesn't seem that surprising that trying to create some radical land project with 3 wonderful, lovely strangers is a very different thing to doing it with your best mate that you've been planning it with for years. But I kind of really ground myself into the dirt trying to make this work. You know, I was sleeping 3 hours a night. I was just barely eating. I was absolutely falling apart in this situation, till eventually I was like, God, I just need to let this go. But when I reflected on, like, why did I cling to that so hard? Like, why did I let that damage me so much? What it came down to, I think, was those kind of stories. It was like how, you know, I sort of quit my conventional job back in 2005 because I was concerned about collapse, really, is how I'd phrase it now, and was trying to work out how to engage with that, how to relate to that. And all my friends were like, what are you doing? You know, like, what's your career plan? Like, what are you doing with your time? And I didn't really know. I was just like, well, I'm going to just read some things and try and find something that feels true. But, you know, back in the mid 2000s, there wasn't really anything much online around kind of collapse or any kind of places to look around that. There's a few people like Richard Heinberg who were talking about this stuff, but I didn't really have answers. And so what was this like, you know, nearly 10 years later, there was something in me that was really like, if I can get this piece of land and like build a beautiful ecological home on it, and, you know, then all my friends, my peers, my family will be able to look at that and go, oh, so it did lead to something that I can recognize as success. You know, it did lead you to like a place that I can see as like a nice place to live your life. And it's mad, but like very human, I think, that I was unconsciously so attached to that outcome of how it would look in other people's eyes, that I was pursuing something that was making me deeply miserable for that sake. And it was when I let that go, you know, that was kind of what I would now call stepping into the space between stories. It was like letting go of my previous story of what I was trying to do with my life. And I mean, I was going to say being brave enough, but in this case, it was just being beaten up enough to let that story go and step into the kind of fertile void that exists when you kind of don't have a story. And it's an incredibly hard place to be, but it's actually where the magic happens. You know, it's actually the place we need to step into when our stories don't make sense anymore. And of course, in times like these, and I, you know, don't need to tell you guys in your audience what I mean by this, like the stories that we've been raised with about what's important more and more don't make sense to us. And so it was only by kind of going through that dark night of the soul, if you like, that I was able to recalibrate, like, you know, create a story that really deeply makes sense to me, like appreciate even what these stories were that I'd incorporated into myself. And then start off on a path which actually felt deeply good and joyous, and like, yeah, this isn't exhausting every day. This is actually nourishing every day. And so that's probably the biggest, deepest answer to your question, is like the hard thing is, yeah, identifying in yourself where you've kind of internalized the values of a society that's falling apart, and being ready to step into something that's ultimately a lot more joyous. But the casting off from the shore without knowing there's another shore in sight is a scary thing.
So you mentioning those items, I feel like leads me to another question I was going to ask. And you alluded here to what's challenging about it, but you also gave some great advice about, you know, it's got to be something that you enjoy yourself. Like you're trying to live your life. The purpose of resilience isn't to try and do something you don't want to do or be someone you don't want to be. You have to enjoy it, especially because it's going to be hard. And then you also mentioned that, yeah, this is really hard because you're trying to battle what you've been taught your entire life growing up, trying to battle the idea of what success is and what other people think you should be, and everything that goes along with that. So my question is, to the average listener who is working a 9-to-5, who is caught in the rat race, who is dealing with the normal, you know, feelings of materialism and just what everyone else is going through, what's your advice for them to find what it is that does make them happy along the route to resilience?
Well, if my previous answer was quite, I don't know, emotional and feeling based, like this is probably quite maybe more practical than you'd expect. Like my absolute number one thing that gave me freedom was reducing my need for money, like learning to live cheap. Like we're so trained that like what we need to do is increase our income, you know, like got to increase our income and then we can spend more and then we'll be happier. But actually, if we decrease our expenditure, it's like buying freedom. It's amazing. Like, you know, the less you have to spend, the less you have to sell your time in order to exist. And the more space you open up for, yeah, finding your joys or just pursuing them. You know, I think a lot of people know perfectly well what their joys are, but they don't have time to do anything about them because they're working so bloody hard all the time. And so, you know, one thing I really learned from my late mentor, David Fleming's work, we talked about last time, you know, if I had to summarize all of his work into a nutshell, it would be that the financial economy is not a good place to look for our resilience, you know, for our security. We're told that we should be, you know, having savings and a pension and buying a house and all this kind of stuff. And people all over the world know already that that's not a very secure place to place our future. That, you know, if things go wrong in this mysterious thing we call the economy, then suddenly the money in your bank account can disappear, or you can't access it, or inflation makes it worth vastly less than it was at a ridiculous rate, or whatever it may be. And so where can we look as an alternative to base our life in? And the two answers are relationships, you know, what David Fleming calls the informal economy, the non-monetary economy, you know, actually building relationships of trust and reliance on each other. You know, that isn't going to evaporate, you know, whatever. And we all know that when you fall on financially difficult times, you end up relying on your relationships, on your friends, on your family, on your community, whatever it may be. So that's the first thing, is I think, like, you know, for me, a big thing was when my mum lived in southwest London. You know, when I quit my job back in 2005, I moved in with her, you know, and that was a way that, in a very practical sense, like instead of using money to pay rent, I used a relationship to have a place to live. And obviously everybody's circumstances differ and different possibilities are there for different people. But that's one thing, is like, to what extent can I get the things that I need out of relationships rather than out of money? And actually, Mark, who I mentioned, wrote a book called The Moneyless Manifesto, which is basically a guidebook for that. It's like how to go on holiday for free, how to have somewhere to live for free, how to get food for free, you know, all of these things, and not necessarily to go all the way to moneylessness, and probably not, but just, you know, again, the more we reduce our dependence on money, the more freedom we have. You know, there's this phrase, time is money, right? I think of it the other way around. Money is time. Like, you know, if I've got £1,000 in the bank, great. That means I don't need to work for the next however long. You know, I can give my time to whatever is important to me, to building resilience or following my passions or whatever it is. There's another amazing book. What's it called? The Art of Frugal Hedonism. That's an Australian book, which is very much on the same theme, and I also really recommend. So that's one thing, is relationships. The other thing is the natural world, the ecology. Like we were talking about with the Happy Pig, you know, you can buy alcohol from the brewers, or you can make it from plants, because that's what the brewers did. And, you know, ultimately it's, you know, that's the root of all wealth. So the more that we can directly, you know, like the classic example, you know, grow your own food, you don't need to buy the food, right? And there are pros and cons to all of that. But again, the natural world, much as we're doing our best collectively to decimate it, is a much more reliable source of security than finance. So I would say the first step is figure out how to minimize your financial outgoings. And then I think naturally, any of us, when we don't feel like we have to give all our time to a paycheck, well, what do you do when you don't have to do anything else? You probably follow your passions, you know. I mean, actually, I'd say there's a step before that. The first step is you're just completely exhausted. So if you get a bit of freedom, you probably spend it like vegging out on the sofa, or, you know, just being, because that's what we do when we're exhausted. But then if we start, you know, building a bit more time and a bit more freedom into our lives, there comes a point where that starts to feel pretty unsatisfying. And then we start usually, maybe looking up some old friends, you know, maybe going to, whatever it is, you know, going to play football because that's always what we loved, or, you know, going for a walk in the woods, or so yeah, like reclaim some of your lives from the financial economy. That would be my key advice. And it's been the absolute marker of my path, for sure. If I look back at all the things that I'm really excited to have done over the last, nearly 20 years now since I quit that job, a marker of lots of them is that they weren't paid. You know, lots of the things I did were unpaid, and I could do that because I was living cheap. And then you find yourself doing all sorts of interesting things.
You know, as I hear it, and I love it, Shaun, it's like something about kind of freeing yourself from the traditional story, the narrative that's there. It sounds so liberating, and it really is. Like, I think almost everybody is just so caught up in thinking about, I got to make more money so that then I can do something that makes me happy. And yet they spend all their time just getting more and more exhausted, working so hard for that money. So I love hearing about all that. When I think about, you know, we talk about resilience as a relative term. It's very broad in scope, but from just the preparedness, like kind of traditional stance on preparedness, there are all these different things that need to be in place, right? Like, you've got to make sure you've got enough food and enough water, you've got the shelter, you've got, you know, communication and sanitization and, you know, medicine and all these things. As you've gone through this process, I imagine you've been able to kind of narrow it down and remove the fluff and focus on the things that matter most in your mind. For somebody who's just starting down this path of resilience, what is it beyond just kind of getting outside of a reliance on money and building relationships? What is it that they should be focusing on if they want to be resilient?
I mean, firstly, just because you mentioned about getting beyond the story of money, I'm sure some of your listeners have heard it already, but I have to briefly share that story of the Mexican fisherman, which you might be familiar with. Genius. Like, so basically there's a fisherman and he lives on the coast and he catches the fish he needs each day and feeds his family, and he's really good at fishing, so it doesn't take him long, and then they spend the rest of the day, you know, singing songs around the fire. And then one day this American businessman turns up and says, hey man, you know, you're really good at fishing, why don't you like stay out for 6 hours instead of 3 hours, and you catch twice as many fish, you could sell the surplus. And he's like, well, sure, but what would I do with that? Well, you know, then you could buy another boat, and then you could catch 4 times as much, and then over time you could build a whole fleet, and then eventually you'd have a whole fishing company. And he's like, well, sure, but like, what would I do then? He's like, well, then you could, you know, sell the fleet, you'd have a fortune, and then you could just spend your time, I don't know, maybe catching a few fish, hanging out with your family on the beach, you know, singing some songs. And he's like, yeah, I think you can keep your MBA, mate. I just think that story so beautifully sums up the madness that you were just mentioning there, Kellan. But yeah, I mean, the key thing is community, I would say. You know, the key thing is friendships and joy, shared enjoyments, you know, whatever that looks like for you. You know, it could start with just like, I'll spend more time chatting shit with my best mate, you know, because I never find time these days, you know, we're always so busy. And then, you know, you do a bit more of that, and it's fun, and you start to feel a bit more like a human again. But after a little time, you probably start going, you know, maybe we should pursue that crazy idea that we're always talking about, you know, and like maybe, and you know, it's those people, it's the people with whom we have deep allegiances with. Like, there's nothing that gives more resilience than those relationships. And I think we all know that, you know, with the kind of capitalist imperative to give all our time to earning money, like we tend to neglect those relationships, and we tend to wake up 20 years later and think, God, you know, I haven't spoken to Greg in, like, I don't even know, is he married? I don't even know anymore, you know? Yeah, I would say that, like, you know, relationships. And I would also not limit the term relationships to the human world. You know, it could be relationships with a place. It could be relationships with a forest, or with animals, or, you know, whatever. Like, I think, yeah, I mean, if I extend the word relationships beyond the human world, then in a sense, relationships are what it's all about. Because, you know, I was talking about growing our own food or whatever. I mean, in a wider sense, you could talk about that as being relational as well. And you know, what's fascinating about David Fleming's work is that he makes the case that you know, we tend to think of our society today as being, you know, the most advanced civilization there's ever been. But then you look at the fact that a couple of 100 years ago, in, say, England or France, holidays made up, you know, a third to a half of the year. And you think, what? Like, but they didn't have all this technology, all these machines, all these factories to do all the work for them. So how come they're like slacking off and we're working so hard? Like, what's that about? And, you know, the beauty of the way that they arranged their society, without all the kind of advanced technologies, was that all that time off, they didn't spend completely exhausted and vegging out. You know, they created carnival and culture and music and play, and were constantly in this kind of, I mean, often it was tied in with religion, but like constantly were in this kind of cycle of year-round festivals and carnival and all of this. And that requires a bunch of work. You know, you've got to build the stages and the costumes and learn the parts and all of this stuff. And that was the fabric of day-to-day life. And that kind of thing knits communities together, you know, like, you know, oh my God, you know, Steve and his family are really struggling at the moment, but like, we've got to look after them, because, you know, what would the carnival be if we didn't have Steve's song at the end, you know, like that's the highlight. And so, yeah, I would really pursue those two things, relationships and the things that really bring joy to our existence and make our lives worth living. You know, all the things that seem frivolous, like the arts and culture, are in many ways kind of the point. I mean, you know, David had this lovely phrase. He talked about the needle hiss, you know, like when you play a record and there's all the crackling and everything in the background. And he said, unfortunately, our economic systems today are completely focused on the needle hiss and completely miss the actual point, the actual things that make life worth living. And stuff like making sure people have got enough to eat, that should be just a given. We should have taken care of that a long time ago. But unfortunately, we're doing things so badly that we're, frantically worrying about how to feed and shelter people. And yeah, I would say it's about building relationships and building joy. And as you do that, I think resilience kind of comes in not as a drudgery, like, oh God, I've got to do that to secure things like, I don't know, paying for insurance or something, but much more as an excitement, as a of course we want to keep this going because it's wonderful.
Which I think is great advice all around, right? In any context. We're talking here about resilience. And like you said, it's a precursor to true resilience to build those relationships. But like in any context, what really should be the focus is those things that are really fulfilling, building that community. One thing that I anticipate as people hear you talk about relying less on money, focusing more on relationships, that could lead some to think, oh, you're trying to tell me I should just be more of a leech or a moocher or rely more on other people. And it's a shift toward like not contributing as much and instead just taking more from the relationships around me. But I don't think that's what you mean. So I'd love to have you expand on that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, well, maybe I'll repeat something I think I said during our last conversation, which is, I think one of the dominant stories in our culture, maybe the dominant one about what we should do with our time is you must be financially independent, right? That's your first responsibility if you're going to be a respectable member of society. Like, as you say, otherwise you're a parasite, right? You're a leech. You're just, relying on other people's hard work and all of that. And I would argue that that is completely mad. And I will try to convince your listeners of that right now. Because I don't think financial independence even exists. Like everybody is dependent on someone. If you're a billionaire, someone else still built your house. Someone else still grew your food. The only thing that money allows you to do is be dependent on people you don't know instead of being dependent on people you do know. That's literally it. And actually, that's kind of miserable. And this is part of the reason why, rich people are often quite unhappy because, they can consume in the way that society tells us should be really satisfying. But actually, they kind of have the experience that they don't really need anyone. That's this illusion of financial independence that, if someone annoys me, well, fine, they can get lost and I'll just pay someone else for, whatever it is that I want. And also, they feel really suspicious of kind of everyone in their life. Well, are they just here because they want to get hold of my money or do they really like me? So it's kind of a miserable place to be, this illusion of financial independence, because actually, as I say, they're still dependent on people. It's just that the people are interchangeable. And yet, despite the fact that illusion, A, doesn't exist, A is an illusion, and B isn't really very desirable because it makes people miserable. I mean, there's loads of research on people who win the lottery and how it actually usually makes them really unhappy because suddenly they don't have a peer group anymore. All their friends are in a completely different situation from them suddenly. If they go to the pub and buy everyone in the pub a round of drinks because I just won the lottery, then they're, flash and showing off and, who likes that? If they don't, then they're stingy and like, what the hell are they doing? They've got millions in their back pocket. Maybe their friend's daughter's sick and like, do they pay for their operation for them? Well, probably, but then their whole relationship with their friend kind of shifts because suddenly they're in this kind of donor benefactor type relationship, or do they not, in which case they're a scumbag. Like, whatever you do, you've kind of lost your peer group, your friends. And so, quote, financial independence is a pretty miserable place to be. And yet most of the people in our society give most of the hours of most of the days of most of their life to trying to get there instead of doing whatever it is they might want to do with their lives. And, like, that sounds like it must be an exaggeration, but it isn't. Like, that's how crazy the dominant stories in our culture are. Like, most of the people give most of the hours, most of the days, most of their life to pursuing something that doesn't exist, and that the illusion of it is actually not a very happy place to be. So I would really encourage people to examine that idea that, you know, relying on people out of love rather than out of money is being a parasite. I think that's one of the most toxic ideas in our culture, but it's so deep in us. Like, you know, if you, Kellan, or, you know, whoever's listening, don't feel like you're in a place of financial independence, you probably feel guilty about it. You probably feel shame. You probably don't want to mention it to your family, and you want to kind of hide it, and you don't want people to know. Again, because it's been sort of indoctrinated into us really by our whole society. But I don't think it's true. And I think the beauty of, you know, talking to our friends about how it's not true, if you agree with me that it's not, is that then you can start to think, well, okay, if that isn't real, and if actually, you know, the flip side of it is that if you are kind of in a good place financially, it can be really hard to actually support your friends, because they feel really uncomfortable with accepting any kind of financial help, because they feel like that's putting them in the place of being a parasite and being dependent. And it's so pervasive and toxic, it's crazy. But if you can actually get to the place where you're like, you know, that's part of the joy of something like the Happy Pig, is that when people come, you know, we offer them a bed for the night, and that just feels nice. But if we said, let me give you 50 quid to go and pay for a night in a hotel, that would feel a lot less comfortable. That would feel like, what, do you think I'm some kind of charity case? Like, what the hell? I don't need your 50 quid. I can pay for my own hotel room. Thanks very much. But somehow just, yeah, you know, we've got a bed. You're welcome to sleep in it. That feels all right. Feels nice. And so in some ways, yeah, you could argue, I hadn't really thought of it this way before, but you could argue a lot of what we're doing is finding the ways in our culture, you know, in an Irish context. It will look different in other places around the world, obviously, but in our culture, kind of finding a way to give people experiences of living outside of that, yeah, that toxic drive to, you know, avoid being perceived as a parasite. Because as you say, it's deep and it's important. But once we see that it's not grounded in any real truth, then I think we can start reevaluating, you know, what we want to do with our days.
Shaun, I appreciate that point of view. I think it's awesome, and listening to it, like it rings so true to me as somebody who's spending most of my hours of most of my days of most of my life trying to gain financial independence. So definitely a thinker there, and I'm sure I'll spend the next several months dwelling on that. But I do have, you know, here at the end of the call of our conversation, I do want to ask about something which you have mentioned briefly here, and which we talked about last year as well, which is your deeper dive program that you do. I would love to hear what is that all about. Where can people learn more about it and join if they would like?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, so this is a kind of partnership with Stirling College in Vermont. I don't fly. I quit flying 20 years ago now. So I've never actually been to the US, but have kind of remotely established this partnership over there. And yeah, essentially, you know, for all the interesting adventures I've been on over the years, you know, at one point I think there was part of me that thought, oh, you know, maybe I can save the world, you know, maybe I can head off this whole collapse thing, you know, if we just made some wiser decisions and we campaigned in the right directions and all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, I don't believe that anymore. But I do believe that we can live good lives in this context. I do believe that we can live joyous lives and meaningful lives and good lives. And I suppose because I haven't found any neat, easy answers to how it makes sense to live in these times, what I'm really interested in is creating spaces where we can talk about that. You know, like if we're in a context where, yeah, there are no easy answers, but we still all have to decide what we're going to do with our days. well then, let's talk about it, because it's the kind of conversation, as no doubt a lot of your listeners know. I mean, my work goes under this name of dark optimism, and that's because bright shiny optimism kind of winds me up. It's like, well, actually everything really isn't fine. It just ain't.
Totally.
But at the same time, if we look with open eyes at the darkness, at the challenges of our time, as I say, there's still good things to do with our days. And so I think very often the problem that people like us who are aware of this stuff face is that we want to have conversations with people about kind of what dark optimism looks like. What would it mean to do something good in a difficult time? But if they're not familiar with the dark, if they're not familiar with the fact that all the things that you guys have been talking about on your couple of podcasts, then you kind of come in and you say, oh, let's talk about, but they're like, what? What are you on about? And then you end up just talking about the dark all the time, and you never get on to talking about the dark optimism. You just become the doom guy, right? Who's always going on about all this awful stuff. And so, yeah, I've both in person at the Pig, but also online through this program, wanted to create a space where people could be able to talk about that, be in a space where everyone else has a similar perspective on what's unfolding on our planet and in our society, and talk about what it means to live well in these times. And I invite a guest each week who I think really embodies one really great path. So some of our guests for the forthcoming one, off the top of my head, we've got Nate Hagens, who runs this amazing online channel, has been a friend of mine for nearly 20 years now, but now runs this channel, The Great Simplification. So his kind of path has been kind of educating people about what's going on and kind of deepening the conversations around that. Lila June, who's an Indigenous American woman who does amazing work on how actually those much older cultures that have thrived for much longer than capitalist ones could even dream of thriving, actually do have a lot of answers to ways that we could heal our relationship with the natural world, for example. Rob Hopkins, who's founder of the Transition Towns movement and does a lot of work around how communities can come together and see resilience not as an individual thing but as a collective thing. Ian McGilchrist, who was a big topic of conversation in our last course, who talks about how our minds work and our brains work and how that influences the stories that we give meaning and power to. And so, each of these guests, in a way, I mean, we've been running these courses for 5 years now. This will be the 5th year. Each of them it becomes a kind of avatar, if you like, for us. So I keep this to a small group of 50 people, so that we can really build community within the group and have many great friends from the previous cohorts. And so as our guests come, they sort of represent the part of me that thinks, oh, I want to be an activist and try and change some of the things that are wrong, or the part of me that's like, oh, I just want to write books and educate people, or the part of me that's like, I want to just retreat and create a beautiful home and grow amazing food and restore a piece of land, or whatever it may be. Our guests are some of the most inspiring people I know of in terms of walking paths through these times. And inevitably, some of our group are really drawn to what they're saying, or to what they're saying, or to what they're saying, or actually really disagree with what they're saying. And then through various formats, we talk about that. It's quite an intensive thing spread over 9 weeks. And there's different formats that suit different people. So we have ongoing kind of video calls to talk about these things. We have a written forum where we discuss them. We have what we call social sessions, which is where we kind of all come together and then go into breakout small groups. And also I offer various kind of resources, videos, reading, etc., that kind of help us to deepen into both what's unfolding, but also ways that we might think about responding. But really the greatest value in it, I think, and certainly for me, and I think for the other participants, is the kind of fellowship. Again, that kind of relating. I really hold close to my heart a review that one of the participants last year left. I think they said something like, I was so excited about being exposed to thinkers and activists who were further along this path than me. But what I've come to realize is that actually we're very much all on the same path together. And yeah, I think for me, certainly kind of all that time ago, there was no harsher feeling than feeling alone with the apocalypse. And I think it's really easy to feel like that in our quite atomized societies. And so essentially, yeah, it's a place to come together with others who have a sense of what's going on and just really, yeah, reflect deeply on what we are doing and what we might want to do and what's working and what isn't working. And yeah, I love it. It feels so deeply part of my work in the world. Yeah, if people are interested, I'd say the next live 9-week deeper dive will start January 9th. I think about a third to a half of the places are gone so far, speaking kind of end of October. You can find it if you just search online for Stirling College Surviving the Future. You'll find it. There's also a self-directed version that is available all year round, which is called A Path Through Tumultuous Times. And a lot of people have, done that and then come to do a live course when it next comes around. But yeah, the deep dive we run once a year. I did try running it twice a year at one point, but that was just too intense. So yeah, each winter. And yeah, I don't know if you've got any questions about it, but it really feels an important thing.
Well, I know that we last time around when we spoke about this, we did have some of our listeners that joined you on the deeper dive. I believe there was several of them. So I'm hoping that's the same case this time, that somebody who is listening out there hears this and it calls to them and they do join. So we will put a link to that in the episode description here for them to be able to find that. This should be posted around the beginning of November, so hopefully there are still some spots left for anyone that wants to join Shaun on his journey through the deeper dive.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because yeah, a couple of people who came to it through our last conversation have become good friends now and really really valued it. I think one of them actually is planning to do it again this coming January. So.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for making that connection. It's really enhanced my life as well.
Wonderful. Well, Shaun, thank you so much for your time today. This has been an awesome interview full of tons of good advice. I am excited to post this for everybody to hear it. I'm going to listen to it again myself to make sure I really internalize everything that you said. But I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again, hopefully inviting you back to have more and more conversations in the future.
It'll be a joy, guys. And yeah, thank you for all you're doing. I think it's really, I heard about this through a friend who was like, "Oh my God, have you heard Breaking Down Collapse?" So yeah, you're doing the good work. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaun.